you mentioned earlier that the slave trade continued after the United States outlawed the slave trade in 1808. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how that worked?
Yeah, so I think after it was outlawed, the slave trade in the U.S. outlawed. I mean, it kind of shifted. It was still sort of people were still sending enslaved people to various other places, right? Like Cuba and Brazil, perhaps most notably, continued to traffic and enslave people. But then, even after the trade ended, there was kind of what people now call the domestic trade, where it became a question of how enslaved people are shifted and moved around the U.S. So, and this kind of corresponds to, breeding and also renting out and sharing, but also actually it corresponds to the movement west, and in many ways, slavery could assume a different form in other parts of the country. So I think a lot about Kentucky and writing about Kentucky, where in some ways, Kentucky is west of West Virginia. And at that time there was no West Virginia, so just initially when Kentucky's founded in like the 1790s, west of Virginia is Kentucky, and the people who came to Kentucky naturally being from Virginia, in many ways, thought of themselves as trying to kind of perfect the republic, and they sometimes called it a second paradise. They were like trying to make Kentucky as good as Virginia, but even better, and in some sense they were influenced by Thomas Jefferson, who had wanted to eliminate the use of capital punishment for serious crimes. And he had been traveling in France where they've been introducing penitentiaries. And, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that penitentiaries were initially a kind of liberal reform, and they were actually seen as a substitute for just hanging people or something like that. And this created this circumstance where, Kentucky, on the one hand, had slavery, but also was understanding itself as a much more noble, enlightened form of practicing enslavement. So in Kentucky also couldn't really have, they couldn't have plantations, like the agriculture wasn't suited to it. So instead of growing cotton, they wound up growing hemp. And so slavery in Kentucky took the form of enslaved people either working in livestock, but often largely in tobacco or hemp, and on small plots. So Kentucky had like legalized slavery, but it wasn't like huge plantations with like a lot of slaves. And so to kind of just say more about that story though, essentially what would happen is in Kentucky, they wound up building this prison when they first settled it following Thomas Jefferson's the insight, and they thought of this as like actually being like progressive, and instead they wouldn't have capital punishment, they would have prison instead. And the first crime someone was convicted for was stealing a horse, and you could have been put to death for that crime before in Virginia, and instead this man had like a few months in jail. But over the decades, the prison was not profitable at all, and they sort of realized that they wanted to make it profitable. And this guy named Joel Scott, he convinced the state legislature to lease out the prison to him, and he would sort of run it as his own private business. And this is in 1825. So what's interesting about that is that, there's been a lot of attention lately toward the 13th Amendment and this idea that enslavement continued after it was legally outlawed through the 13th Amendment, which says that you cannot be convicted, you cannot be enslaved unless you're first convicted of a crime. But actually, as early as 1825, Kentucky was allowing people who were incarcerated to essentially be treated like enslaved people. Because what Joel Scott did was he introduced hemp farming into the prison, which had only been done by enslaved people until that juncture. And so by having people who are incarcerated now farm hemp in the prison, he essentially introduced this form of slave labor to the prison. And significantly, the people in that prison were mostly white initially. And they were like white men, and then later women, and eventually there'll be people of various races in the prison. But it sort of reveals that this idea of convict leasing, or sort of the idea of having incarcerated people working as slaves, started several decades before the 13th Amendment was even passed. And it wasn't even just initially pioneered on African people, it was used on people first.
And that's the, am I right that that's the subject of the graphic novel that you're
Yeah,
working on?
exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah, and in some ways it's like a creative nonfiction book, but it's a graphic book, and basically telling this story about the history of convict leasing in Kentucky. And I'm kind of letting Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells be the kind of narrators of the story, because they had this conflict, because they both wrote about convict leasing, first of all, but they also had this conflict around the Chicago World's Fair in the 1890s, where they initially agreed to boycott it because there was such poor African American representation in the Chicago World's Fair. But then Frederick Douglass was invited to speak by the Haitian delegation because he had formerly been an ambassador. And Ida B. Wells was upset that after agreeing to boycott it, that he would go ahead and participate in it. And they later patched it up. And Ida B. Wells wound up editing this book called "The Reason Why the Colored American is Not at the Chicago World Exposition," and Frederick Douglass contributed to it. And so I'm kind of using that story of their feud, and then also their work on convict leasing, to tell the story of this prison in Kentucky where it has this history of sort of pioneering convict leasing several decades before the 13th Amendment, which is why the book's called Before 13th. But, I think what it reveals is that although after emancipation, convict leasing would essentially be a way to keep African Americans in a condition analogous to slavery, that's not when it started or why it started. And I guess when I think about the two sort of projects we've been discussing side by side, like the work I've been doing on life insurance and the work on convict leasing, it feels like my argument is essentially that that the history of insurance reveals that even people who were enslaved could be highly skilled and could have sometimes a lifestyle approximating like a highly exploited wage worker. And then the convict leasing work, it's like even someone who's a free citizen could be exploited and have a lifestyle approximating that or approaching that of an enslaved person. And it's as if like highly skilled enslaved people and highly exploited free white people, there's a kind of continuum there where you could be on either side of the continuum, and there's even a porous boundary between them. Like some historians have shown that like in places like Maryland in the last few decades of legalized slavery, if an enslaved person escaped and they were managing a household, like as a maid, they might just hire like a newly arrived European immigrant and pay them very little. So almost like a very skilled slave that they pay nothing, and a not quite as skilled European immigrant who they pay very little, was almost interchangeable for some of these households, So I think that's a very interesting story about kind of the porous boundaries around race and skill and value.
I think, it gets me thinking about sort of the problems that are created between the way that we draw these sort of sharp boundaries in general. I mean, the most famous book of African American history is called From Slavery to Freedom. And there is this like really, I think there's this sense, and I think it actually has sort of a morality, or sort of like a moral content to this, right? That there is this era of slavery, then there's this era of freedom. Slavery is back here, freedom is up here. And you were talking about blurring the lines between sort of the end of the slave trade. I think we can blur the lines between often the North is thought of as free before the Civil War, and the South is thought of as enslaved, when in fact there were many enslaved people in the North. But we still have this attachment to this idea, this sort of sharp break between slavery, era of slavery and era of freedom, and what that means in terms of our morality, sort of our economic relations. And I think you're complicating a lot of that, and the idea of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, right? That's become, I think, a lot more widely known with Ava DuVernay's film, and Angela Davis was talking about this way back. But I mean, even that sort of relies on this idea that there was slavery and then there was freedom, and the forms of exploitation that developed in freedom were of a different kind. And I think there is this way in which we attach or are taught to think about slavery as this untouchable evil, something that's in the past, something that is beyond the pall, something that we can't imagine in our own society, when in fact it is an extremely exploitive economic relationship, but one that is not so far removed from the types of processes of exploitation that we continue to practice today in different forms with different abilities, right? Because one of the things that made slavery work was the degree to which enslaved people could be exploited, right? So part of the equation is also what the labor force will, the power that the labor force has, or the power that workers have. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but I think there is something here about the way in which we draw these really sharp lines between eras and types and the way we think about slavery in general.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think like sometimes when I think about insurance, history of insurance, I think about it like, well, when you go to a slave marketplace, slave auction, you can see the value of people in a sort of readily discernible way, right? They're worth X hundreds of dollars. And then, people are insured for their skills, they're enslaved, legally, technically their property, right? But then with life insurance on free citizens, people freely contract this policy, and it's based on like some kind of actuarial calculus, like projected future wages, family medical history, things like that. But this information that's the basis for the free person's insurance policy is confidential information, right? Like no one knows your salary, no one's supposed to know your salary, no one knows your medical history. These things are sort of confidential by law. And so what you could say about like life insurance, which comes about with the age of freedom, really, like, is that it's essentially like a hierarchy. It's a monetary calculus in the value of human lives, which is based on confidential information. And in a way, obviously that's, I guess, beneficial. No one knows your business. In a way, it's problematic because we really aren't aware of just how discrepant the value is in our lives, like how huge the sort of stratification is because it's based on private information. And that's often what I think of as freedom. Like freedom is sort of personal, private information. It is, the ability to voluntarily contract something, but objectively speaking, it still could be this huge sort of inequality and hierarchy. It's just that it's not public in the same way. It's not explicit in the same way, So freedom can mean a lot of things, but it doesn't mean, as you're saying, as you're pointing out too, like the absence of these coercive structures, like in a way, like people want to believe that there's a sharp break from slavery to freedom, but in fact, so much of what we could say about the free world is a continuation of things that we saw in slavery, or a reconfiguration of things we see in enslavement.